is no objective more important to science than the collection and return of samples from the lunar surface. For never before had we the opportunity to examine extraterrestrial material from a positively known location and context. Fortunately, at the site of the landing, in the southwestern part of the Sea of Tranquility, there was a considerable variety of lunar material, much of it debris from nearby impact craters. First, contingency samples were chosen and collected rapidly. Later, as operations continued smoothly, samples were chosen and collected more deliberately. Within 5 days after the samples were picked up from the lunar surface, where they had lain for millions of years, they were delivered to the Lunar Receiving Laboratory at the Manned Spacecraft Center, Houston, Texas. The importance of the event was underscored by the presence of top NASA officials. The containers were opened inside special vacuum chambers and nitrogen-filled cabinets where decontamination took place. Samples were examined, described, photographed, and weighed. They were then prepared for preliminary physical and chemical analysis. Meanwhile, a number of Earth organisms were exposed to lunar material to assure that there were no pathological hazards. Among the organisms were plants, such as conifer seedlings, and tobacco tissue cultures, invertebrate animals such as insects, shrimp, and the almost microscopic paramecia, and vertebrate animals such as the Japanese quail, and germ-free mice. In an intensive series of biological tests over a number of weeks, there were no indications of pathological effects among any of the organisms. As preliminary investigations continued under the direction of scientists from academic institutions and government agencies, it became apparent that 4 general types of lunar materials had been collected. There was the lunar soil itself, composed of a variety of glasses mixed with crystal and angular rock fragments. There were fine-grained crystalline volcanic rocks, characterized by minerals whose crystalline faces reflected in light, and by bubbles, or vesicles, which formed when the rocks were molten. There were somewhat coarser-grained volcanic rocks, marked by irregular cavities or vugs, which formed when the rocks were partly molten. Common to both types of volcanic rocks were the whitish mineral, which is known as plagioclase feldspar, the darker one, which is clinopyroxene, and the blackish one, which is ilmenite, or an iron titanium oxide. Finally, there were the breccias, comprising fragments of volcanic rock in a matrix of lunar soil. These were formed by impact hardening. Like all the rocks, the breccias are pockmarked by pits formed by the impact of particles traveling at high velocity. In preliminary studies of the lunar samples in the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, there were several significant findings. For instance, all the rocks are similar chemically, pointing to a family relationship. Although the components were known, the proportions are strange, suggesting either formative processes unknown to us on Earth or an unfamiliar bulk composition for the Moon.
Hi, I've just shown you this sample of the about them collecting the lunar rocks. Okay, and you know, the astronaut, one of the Apollo astronauts, there with his little net thing, collecting dust and rocks that then get taken back to Earth. Now, I showed you that clip where, you know, they were being checked for contamination, and there was absolutely no mention there of radiation, and clearly there wasn't any radiation in the soil or the rocks, because none of the creatures were harmed and the plants grew perfectly normally. But they did find it was more or less the same materials as we find on Earth, but composed differently. unknown to us before, which is hardly surprising since they were probably, made in a lab or something, or meteorites from Earth. Who knows what they did? But there was no mention of radiation. Okay, none whatsoever. And so this has come out recently, and this was from December 2009, when they'd sent the LRO to the moon, and they'd attached this thing. This guy had attached this thing to the moon, to the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. It shows that number of high energy particles streaming in from space, and of obviously the sun as well, did not tail off closer to the moon's surface as would be expected, with the body of the moon blocking half the sky. Rather, the cosmic rays created a secondary and potentially more dangerous shower by blasting particles in the lunar soil, which then become radioactive. The moon is a source of radiation, said Boston University researcher Harlan Spence, the lead scientist for LRO's Cosmic Ray Telescope. This was a bit unexpected. Why was it unexpected? How many Apollo missions did they send collecting rocks and dust from the moon? They didn't find any radiation in it. There's no magnetosphere on the moon's got no magnetosphere, no atmosphere. It's being blasted by energy from the sun, blasted by even gamma rays and stuff from outer space. Of course it's completely radioactive. It's completely radioactive, and it's very dangerous particles of radiation as well, So, they start to say, oh, but it'd only be, they said potentially deadly up here. They explained potentially. Okay, potentially deadly radiation. Okay. And then down here they're trying to say, oh, well, it's only, the levels were about what an X-ray technician or uranium miner might normally experience in a year. We are in a period when the radiation risks are elevated but still tolerable. What are you saying here? The scientists are saying it's a source of potentially deadly radiation. NASA is then saying that, oh, well, it's still tolerable. It's what an X-ray technician or uranium miner might normally experience in a year. So are you saying that the regular X-ray technician or uranium miner are dealing with potentially deadly radiation? No. So you're lying, NASA. The scientists have told us in a surprising discovery, the moon itself is a source of potentially deadly radiation. Okay, that's what the scientists have said. NASA is trying to say, water that down. Okay. And one of the holy grails would be to be able to predict the sun's activities and give an all clear on how many days the astronauts could be on spacewalks. Well, what about all those missions they went on? And we know some of them were during periods of high sunspot activity. LRO found about twice as many of the highest energy cosmic rays. These are very, very heavy ionized radiation particles. Okay, much higher than anything we get on Earth. Those that could punch through the telescope itself. As expected, NASA plans to use the information to design shelters and operating procedures for future human excursions to the moon. Oh, have they realised they need to design a shelter now to protect the astronauts from the potentially deadly radiation and gamma rays that are hitting the moon. They know that now, but they didn't know it then. They didn't know in the 1960s, 70s, when they got all that rock and material from the moon, you know. I mean, they collected 22 kilograms of material. Okay. And it wasn't radioactive. Nobody noticed that it was radioactive. And this is what I mean, you know. You need to really, really, humanity, get real, get real, get real. Break away from the fantasy. It's not a fantasy. It's only a fantasy for the sadists, the sado-fascists, because that's what I call them, the sado-fascists, that are controlling our whole planet. And, you know, they really are. They do have the power today to do all kinds of things. And they're so sick that we just cannot allow them to continue. We need to take responsibility for the future now, because these have been controlling our future on the foundation of a pack of lies, myth, mystery and fantasy, you know. Because that's what people read of Babylon. This is Babylon, okay? This is Babylon. This is Babylon. This is Babylon. Myth, mystery. Babylon the Great. All based on myth and mystery. Now, this picture's a really prime example. Look, you know, look at the colours. You can see the colours of everything very, very clearly, can't you? You can see the flag, the colours, colours, colours. But look at the moon. The moon's black and white. Everything else is in colour, but the moon's black and white. No, it isn't. This is colour. This is colour. It should be colour, like a reddish colour. And purplish in some places. Okay, so, you know, look. I mean, this is a fantasy picture. You know, the moon is not that colour. If you could see the colours there, you would see colours on the moon. You know. None of the rocks that came from the moon were radioactive. Nobody said they were radioactive. I mean, just look at his suit. It's absolutely covered in lunar dust. And he apparently got in that module with all that highly radioactive dust on, and then went up into the return craft back to Earth with all this highly radioactive dust floating about in the cabin. Come on. Come on. Wake up. Get real. Get real. You know. We've got to start living. We're not living at the moment. Nobody's living. That's why people are so unhappy. Everybody's so unhappy. You know. And as I say, it's no shame on the American people. In fact, if the American people, when the American people really be what they've always dreamed, when they really do start to realise the true American dream as is embodied in the beginnings of the Constitution, you know, the foundations of the Constitution, and the idea of a free, universally intelligent society that universally embraces humanity as a multiculture, you know, and not as a one world, one faith, new world order, but embraces our natural diversity as part of our oneness. That's our speciality, is our diversity. And You know, like I say, they would have, somebody would have noticed that all this dust was radioactive. And it's highly radioactive. Now, if they're trying to say, as they are very vaguely trying to suggest in this article, well, as NASA is trying to now vaguely suggest, is that, you know, we are in a period when the radiation risks are elevated but still tolerable. As if in the 1960s and 70s the moon wasn't radioactive, it's just suddenly become radioactive recently. No. No. The moon has always been radioactive. Of course it has been radioactive. If Earth had no atmosphere, it would be radioactive. If we had no magnetosphere. The moon is a lot closer to the sun than Mars is. You know, so the moon gets a lot of sun activity. You know, gamma rays from the sun hit the moon. That's a fact. Gamma rays will kill people. So, you know, far from NASA thinking, you know, telling the astronauts, oh, we'll be there, don't worry. We'll be there by, you know, give us 20 years, we'll cover it, or nobody will ever even know, they'll all believe you when. And the more they learn, the further away the moon gets from them. And that's because they tried to run before they could walk. And they've been trying to play catch up ever since. And they just know. And the game is up. The game is up. And as I say, I think America now has a chance to redeem itself. You know, the people, the humanity of America, the really intelligent people have a chance to redeem themselves now and to stand up and say, yeah, brought to us by the men who shot JFK, the men who shot Bobby Kennedy, the men who shot Martin Luther King. 9/11 brought to us by the same neocon pseudo-fascists. Understands what a pseudo-fascist is. They enjoy making people miserable. They enjoy controlling people. They like power over people. And, you know, they will use any intelligence. They'll persuade people. They're very persuasive, either with bribery, blackmail, threats, or promises, or reason. You know, they'll give a reason. Well, we've got to do this because if we don't do this, it means we've come second to Russia, and then we won't be number one in the world, and then Russia will be able to say it's number one in the world. So, you know, we've got to do this as part of our patriotic duty to restore people's faith in America, because otherwise Russia's won. Oh, all right then, I'll do it. It's your patriotic duty. And like a lot of people have already explained, everything at NASA was done on a need-to-know basis per individual, so everybody just did their little bit, you know. And it's the same with 9/11, isn't it? Everybody was operating on their own individual need-to-know basis, but people nonetheless noticed the discrepancies. And this now is the final straw, isn't it? It's the final straw. And they're saying it's 30% to 40% higher than originally expected from radioactive lunar soil. 30 to 40% higher than what? Because there was no radiation, was there? And they put that soil and rocks in a decontamination unit. Well, if they had units to decontaminate radioactive lunar soil, of which nothing was ever even mentioned that it was radioactive, but how did they decontaminate it then? What did they use to take the radiation out of the soil and the lunar rocks? No, the decontamination was for any pathogens that might be in it. So just accept the facts, accept reality. They did not go to the moon, they did not land on the moon.